Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Radio Europa. Thanks for tuning in today. Today on the show, we've got Alex again from Italy to discuss tomorrow's elections. And Laura is with us again to assist with coordination and hosting. Additionally, we have Nick, a special guest from South Africa, who's going to help shed some light on the concerning developments that have reached us over the last week from that part of the world. So, welcome everybody.
Hey.
Hey.
Hi.
Right, so let's get to the first topic then. First of all, if I can come to you, Nick, can you briefly just tell our listeners a bit about yourself and your background in South Africa?
Well, I've been living in born in South Africa, been living here now for 34 years. I'm a consultant on farms. I give consultation to farmers, biological farming consultation. Yeah.
Great, okay. So it's great to have somebody actually from South Africa on the show because obviously, as you know very well, there's been a lot in the news this last week about the land confiscation bill, as I've been calling it, that went through Parliament. Could you give our listeners a bit of a background on this, and particularly the nuances they may not be familiar with, such as what it applies to and any catches and conditions that are involved?
Yeah, great. If I could, before I come to your question, I would just like to get this off the table. You know, this whole land claim is a lie. You know, the false notion that white people stole the land in South Africa is a myth. It's a myth that has been used by political leaders to push this whole land expropriation without compensation issue. The whites didn't steal anything. They have title deeds to their properties and a bond at the bank that they are paying off. You know, the whites ended apartheid system 24 years ago with the explicit constitutional guarantee that the land will never be stolen. But because whites have become a powerless minority, the ANC has become emboldened. Now, to get to your question, it's not a law as of yet. Parliament has agreed to the motion on the expropriation of land without compensation that was tabled by the EFF leader Julius Malema. And they did win with 241 parliamentarians voting yes and 83 voting no. Julius Malema said that the 6% his organization has in Parliament, coupled with the ANC's majority, would ensure that the Section 25 of the Constitution, which deals with property rights, can be amended to ensure that land is expropriated without compensation. It is still a process which will include members of the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. We will engage in extensive public processes and then in August report back to Parliament on which section of the Constitution should be amended and which laws should be passed so the policy is implemented. And this will be August 2018 then. But if I can quote Pieter Groenewald, he's a leader of a small minority white party, the Freedom Front Plus. And he warned South Africans in a media release on Wednesday. And I quote him, "I'm telling every person in the country that the ANC and its opposition partners will amend the Constitution in this regard. They have 2/3 majority, and once the Constitution has been amended, your property can lawfully be taken away from you without compensation." And then he says further on, "I want to enforce the fact that this applies to all property, whether it's a farm or a house in a town or city. Landowners must realize that this process is an analog to the proverbial example of the frog that is put in a pot of lukewarm water, which is then gradually heated until the unsuspected frogs cooked to death." So it's definitely on the table, and it seems to me it's going to happen.
Well, yeah, that's it is very concerning. I mean, a lot of our listeners wouldn't have known that it isn't law yet. So thanks for clearing that up. But I guess the likelihood is that it will become law in August.
Well, yes, they've been pushing this for a long time, and they want this. They are going to push it through.
Yeah, and that's disturbing in itself. And it's interesting what you said at the beginning, because property rights are a very Western European concept. And as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, when Europeans, the Dutch first, and then later the British and whatnot, went to South Africa, the land wasn't owned by anybody. So it was free to be taken and turned into farmland. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. It wasn't inhabited. I mean, the blacks came down from Central Africa, also immigrated into Southern Africa, just as the Europeans did. Originally, the Southern African area was inhabited by the Khoi and the San.
Yeah, so I mean, and the other thing that I understand is that a lot of the blacks from Central Africa came down because of the prospects offered by colonialism. It gave them employment, so they wanted to share in the riches. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would say that's a fair assessment. There were also tribal wars that also pushed some of them out to go and look for other places to live. That is also one of the reasons.
Yeah. So I suppose the overall picture is that the basic premise of this bill, the land expropriation bill, is false. And that's something that our listeners really should understand, the history of that.
It's a myth. It's definitely a myth, and it's a political standpoint they're using to get votes.
Yeah, and I've seen the EFF are particularly exploiting this issue to get support. And speaking of that, when it does become law, I know this is quite speculative, but when it does become law, how quickly do you think there will be action, and how quickly do you think the authorities will begin the process of expropriating the land?
No, I think Julius Malema, the EFF leader, will definitely push for it to be done as quick as possible. As soon as it's implemented, yeah, you can look at a very quick result from that.
So I guess the next logical question is, what's the response going to be of the white communities? And in terms of what's happened already, has there been any response from the white communities to, for example, the Freedom Front Plus's press release or other news reports?
Yeah, whites woke up to a harsh reality that the ANC's, well, let's call it naked land grab policy, would apply to all land, not just agricultural land. So I think a lot of them at this time there's still a lot of mixed feelings amongst the people, disbelief. Some who say that it will never come to that. There are still hundreds of gullible whites who believe that this process will not be carried through, trying to believe that the president will come to his senses and think of food security. I think rurally and urbanly, their actions will all be the same. We're talking about, people's livelihood. If you take a farm from a farmer, he's got nothing else left. They've worked their whole lives for that piece of land. Some have been given down from generations. It's his and his family's food source, income, livelihood.
Yeah, so I mean, when you put it like that, it's important. I think it's very important for people to wake up and smell the coffee, as it were, especially those who are still lulled into a false sense of security. On that point, looking more long term, what would you say? What does the future look like, in your opinion, for whites in South Africa? I mean, is this likely to result in a mass exodus or some sort of civil unrest, or what does that look like?
Well, it's difficult to see a future for whites in South Africa at this moment in time. I think the land expropriation, and that's my personal feeling, I think the land expropriation without compensation is just the beginning of a number of things yet to come. There will definitely be unrest. I mean, people aren't going to give up that easily. I mean, you've got a 500 or 1,000 hectare farm that's been in your family for generations, or you've worked your whole life for to build it up. And I mean, you've got loans at the bank that you need to repay. That's, you know, that's a whole other subject on its own. So I think, yes, civil unrest there will definitely be, but we'll see that closer to August, as August approaches.
Yeah, I'd imagine once it becomes law, if indeed it does, then that will be the catalyst. Whereas now, I suppose people are still thinking about it. On that point about civil unrest, I've heard, and I think a lot of us have heard about a group. Are they called the Suidlanders?
Suidlanders, yes.
Yeah. Do they? I mean, because as I understand it, they're on the lookout for the potential for unrest because they want to protect against it. Do you know much about them, or if they have a plan in particular for this scenario?
Well, I've heard of them. There's a lot of such organizations that's trying to make a safe haven for whites, and they don't easily make their plans available. You know, obviously they don't want everyone to know about that if civil unrest does get out of control. Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I suppose it makes sense for them to keep things close to the chest.
Yeah.
And finally, on that point, I wanted to ask you. I mean, because it's easy for us to have an opinion, not being there. But as a South African, do you think a situation like Oranje on a larger scale is a potential long-term solution for the white population?
Yes, I definitely think so. You know, for the whites to survive, they're going to need to gravitate to one point. As a minority in this country, we are far too less and widely spread to protect ourselves and each other. So at some point we'll need to establish ourselves as a majority, where we can protect ourselves as well as each other. So that's something that we'll have to market underneath each other so that we can get that to reality.
Yeah, I mean, from an outside perspective looking in, it does seem like a logical solution, because if you can't, you need to somehow separate yourselves from the problem. So it does look like a good solution in that respect. And just finally, I want to open up the floor to you. Is there anything you'd like to say to our listeners in Europe that we haven't mentioned about the situation at the moment?
Well, I think we've covered most of it. I think this is all a power. This all goes about keeping power. It's about power and keeping power, and it's about driving the white minority out of South Africa. I believe this government, and if you talk about the ANC and the EFF, you can call them Marxist, Leninists. They want to nationalize everything, and I think it's a harsh reality that their followers will also realize at some point.
I mean, it is important to note that the ANC, as I understand it, in South Africa are hardcore Marxists. Essentially, they do want state oversight in a lot of aspects of civil life, and I mean, as we know, too much state intervention, whether it's black or white or whatever, can have horrific consequences. So I'd like to say to our listeners, if you don't know much about the situation in South Africa, do some Google searches, look it up, educate yourself, because it is important, and it will be an important issue going forward for the country. And obviously, Nick, thank you very much for sharing your insight on that, and I wish you all the best for the future, and hopefully you can come back on to give us some updates in the weeks and months to come.
Thank you, William, for having me. Thanks, guys.
You're very welcome. So before we get on to the next issue, where Alex and myself are going to discuss a particularly profound book that we've both read recently, I just want to bring Laura in on the South African issue because she's been in contact with some people about this. I'll let her tell you all about it, and I think she's got some interesting insights to share. So Laura, if you want to take over.
Thank you. Yes, anybody who listened to the pilot episode of our podcast, you might remember that I mentioned on Twitter we once shared a video which was a lady called Janice Atkinson, and she asked the European Parliament if they wanted to investigate the farm murders in South Africa, and the Parliament voted no, they didn't want to investigate it. So I've been speaking to her a little bit this week, and she is absolutely relentless in the work that she's doing for South Africa. She really does care a lot, and she's got some really great publications coming out. Some publications are already out as well, and she's done some really good speeches, not just about the farm murders, but also about the land motion as well. So, like I said, I've been speaking with her, and she asked me to share a few things on Defend Europa, and also mention it on the podcast, and share a few things on my personal Twitter as well. So I just wanted to say, if anybody's listening, if you'd like to give her a follow on Twitter, her handle is and then it's Janice for Brexit, and that's the number 4. She's a member of, I think she's an independent MEP. She used to represent UKIP, but she's also the vice president for the is it Europe of Nations and Freedom Party, which is a political group in the European Parliament. But yeah, she's very based. She does care a lot, and she takes a lot of abuse, but she doesn't care. So over the course of this weekend, we're going to be sharing some of her speeches and some of her publications on our Twitter account. So if you get the chance, please do give them a retweet. And also as well, I've been speaking to like family members and people at work, and I think one of the biggest problems that we have, not with just the South Africa issue, but with a lot of the topics that we discuss, is that the general public just aren't really aware because the mainstream media don't report on them. So if you do get a chance, please do give some of these stuff a retweet, and like I say, give Janice a follow as well on Twitter. That's it, really.
Yeah, I'll echo those sentiments. If you don't already follow Janice Atkinson, she's doing great work as an MEP for England. As Laura said, she used to be part of UKIP. She split with them over ideological differences. They're just not on the ball. So if you go give her a follow, that's at Janice for Brexit. And as Laura said, we'll get some of her stuff out to you. And yeah, it's very important to share this stuff. So I think now that we've discussed South Africa, I think myself and Alex have both read a book lately, Why We Fight, by Guilam Faye. And if I've got the pronunciation of his name wrong, I sincerely apologise. But we did earmark some time to discuss this. So Alex, if you want to sort of explain a little bit about the book, and maybe tell us what you think the key points that you've taken from it are.
Of course, with pleasure. So this is probably the best book and most interesting book I've read in my life. It's not a big book. It's only, let me check, around over just 200 pages. And it's basically 2/3 of the book is basically a dictionary. There are hundreds of around 100 terms, and all of these terms are explained in details by the author. Terms like immigration or humanitarianism, homophilia, hierarchy, and so on. It's a very interesting book because it teaches you about certain concepts that we're not used to think about it, such as metapolitics and how to fight the modern political warfare. I think that many right-wingers nowadays need to focus on. And of course, this means optics. This book tells you how to fight and how we, the right-wingers, the conservatives, the real conservatives, not of course neocons and all those kind of people, we are the resistance. You know, all this hashtag in the US, like the Democrats pretending to be the resistance and all those jokes, they of course aren't, but we are. We are the European resistance. And I think the focal point of this book is the discovery or the rediscovery of our ethnic consciousness. What does that mean? Living and understanding who we are, what's our heritage, our history. And it's that easy, at least according to me, since the book convinced me, and according to the author. The moment the European peoples understand who they are, it will be easy to fight back. Right now, many people being brainwashed into hating themselves, into being basically ethnomasochist. And that's the thing that we need to focus on. We shouldn't fight each other about petty things like how we're going to do certain things about economics. Oh, I'm a capitalist. No, I'm a market socialist. All those things are secondary right now. We need to focus on fighting together the greater evils, like, of course, cultural Marxism and all those anti-white sentiments that have been spread around all around Europe.
Yeah, I mean, it's great for that, isn't it? Because whilst it's titled Why We Fight, it's more of a guide as to how we fight. And I think the metapolitical aspect with the dictionary of terms and sort of challenging you to think about things in a different way is of vital importance. So it helps arm you with the tools to debate properly and to raise issues in a context that are favourable to our ambitions. And like you said, it's interesting in that it says everything else is secondary. The most important thing is becoming who we are, remembering who we are, and then everything else will follow. And that's a viewpoint that I share, and I know you do too. And in particular, this issue of ethnic consciousness is something that stuck out as profound to me, because it's something that Europeans are, well, have generally been bred out of. We're taught from a very young age that ethnomasochism is essentially the right thing to do. And of course it isn't, because we will just not survive as a people if we are continuously masochistic towards our own history and our own identity. The other profound point is that of identity. And Guillaume Fay explains identity in a multifaceted way. So you can be, you can have regional, national and European identity. Alex, I mean, what did you take from that? What does that concept of identity as proposed by Guillaume Fay mean to you?
I totally agree with what Fay says about this, because identity itself is not just one thing. Myself, I see identity as some kind of layers all put together that basically form me. Like, my identity is not just being Italian, but goes back to my city, and then to my province, and then my region, Lombardy, for example. It's part of layers, and one of these layers is being European, which is a thing that ties me to all my other fellow Europeans, to British people, French, the Spaniards, and people need to understand this, that you can be a nationalist for Italy and at the same time care for your region and, identifying as a Lombard without the two things opposing each other, which is something that often causes all this kind of internal clashing in like regions like, for example, Catalonia and Spain. That's a very problematic thing, because like those people, the Catalonians and the Spanish, are very close, both culturally and ethnically, and they shouldn't be fighting each other. Those are not our fights. We had enough fights among us. People need to understand that the European identity is something that we all share, and it's our greatest strength, because the moment we realize that we're all into this together, we're stronger.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that's a really important point for the listeners to take away, is that being a nationalist for your nation and also having not a pan-European, but a shared European interest, those two things are not mutually exclusive, and you can be a good nationalist and a good European, and actually those two things complement each other very well. The English and the French don't need to hate each other, and the Germans and the Austrians don't need to have petty disputes. You can be an Italian, I can be an Englishman, and we have a shared interest in that European ideal. And I think that's a really powerful notion, because throughout history, Europe has been in a state of civil conflict for most of the time. It's, Germany fighting France and Britain fighting, well, seemingly everybody. And it's been a right mess. And in the future, one of the things that will prove to be our salvation is that unifying sense of European identity. On top of that, is there anything else you want to add to that notion of a European identity?
Well, I think we should take notes from what certain groups are doing around Europe when they talk about identity. The various identitarian movements that are being born, also in the US, which are basically teaching people that if we only focus on our own countries, we're not going to go nowhere, because a single state in front of such a great crisis, the migrant crisis and all the influences from America and all those things, if we don't band together, we're gonna lose. It's that simple. This doesn't mean that we need to all bow down to some kind of single government for all Europeans, but this also means that we need to work together. And as you said, we spent centuries fighting each other, and I think that's enough. Because a war among Europeans it's not different from a civil war. It's that simple. It's basically the same thing. And if we don't band together, we're going to have a tough time in the future, because the migrant crisis is just one problem for us. But the moment we solve that, which is of course our most important fight right now, because this is about the great replacement, of course, but the moment we solve that, our fight is not over.
Yeah, that's true. There's a number of issues that we're going to have to tackle as a people for us to prosper and survive in the future. And as you said, it's very difficult for one single national group to do that on their own. And I think the final point I'd make on that identity is that having a European identity as well as your national identity has nothing to do with the European Union. I mean, the identitarians pretty much unanimously oppose the European Union, but they can still have a shared European interest. So it's an important point to make that you don't need to support one to feel the other. So finally, on this point, are there any other concepts from this book that really stood out for you as particularly profound and useful to take forward?
Yes, it's in a way related to the identity thing. When we talk about identity, we are talking also about ethnicity, because a thing that many leftists do, and sadly many so-called civic nationalists, and let me make a small window here, the concept of civic nationalism doesn't make any sense. Why? Because the word nation, which comes from Latin natio, basically implies that to be a citizen, part of the nation, you need to be born there. It has to be blood. It has to be the same blood in the same place of birth. And you can't be a civic nationalist. You can't believe that a person that is not ethnically European can come to Europe and become as European as you. It's not going to happen. And this isn't about being xenophobic or racist. It's just being realistic. We've seen that everywhere. It's been tried. It doesn't work. Look at America, United States. It's a failed civic nationalist state. It's not going to work. And we see them every single day. The racial clashes keep growing, and the tension, all those things. And it's sad. Because this isn't even about rooting for one side or the other. It's just sad, because when you force different cultures together, this is going to happen everywhere, anywhere. It's not about just, because we always focus on the IQ thing, or certain races are this or that. It's not that. When two different groups live together, there is going to be clashes. Period. No discussion about that. But going back to my initial point about the new topic I really cared about, is assimilation. Often certain right, moderate right-wingers talk about integration and assimilation for minorities. Why do I disagree with this? And why does Faye disagree with this? Because assimilation is a crime to both the groups involved, the assimilator and the assimilated. Why is that? Well, of course, the assimilated has to give up parts, or if not most of his identity, to basically assimilate and become part of the so-called multicultural group, which is of course not a great thing to do for that person, because that person is going to suffer, is going to have an identity crisis. And at the same time, the group assimilating other groups will have to change its identity, adapt, and dilute its own identity, which of course is also negative, and that person will suffer. Just look how the mass immigration thing has been forcing us to change even small petty things like movies. So we can no longer have certain kind of movies, or certain kind of foods must be introduced in the market because Muslims don't eat certain things, or made in a certain way. These are small things, but all put together, they change your life. And this is because we are trying to assimilate groups that will never assimilate, because assimilation never fully completes, because it can't happen, because these people are not Europeans, ethnically. And sadly, we can't fix this. There is no way. And if we keep trying to integrate and assimilate, we'll only bring more and more clashes, multicultural and ethnical fractures. And what happens in most cases, as I've noticed in many cities around the area I live, some kind of parallel societies are born, and you go to certain parts of the city and you feel like you're not in your own state anymore. Like in Como, which is a small city of like 30,000 inhabitants, there is a street called Via Milano, which used to be full Italian, of course, and full of beautiful shops, from clothing to, I don't know, butchers and anything, you know, the classic lively street neighborhood. And my grandfather, he used to own a shop there. Then, of course, he sold it and he moved on, and now, 30 years later, it's basically just Muslims. You go there and it's just Turks and Arabs, and if you go there as an Italian, or of course any kind of European, you're gonna stand out. You're gonna be like one of the only guys being there, and people look at you like you don't belong there. And they're not wrong, because they conquered it. It's no longer yours. And this is what the so-called integration, assimilation, multicultural program is. They are colonizing us. That's it.
Yeah, I think Faye makes that point really, really intelligently about, firstly, that assimilation is not the answer, because, like you said, and I think there's a great quote from the book where he says about they lose one identity, but they don't gain another, which obviously provides identity crisis and can account for some of the very violent clashes that you often see amongst migrant groups. And like you said, when groups try to assimilate with each other, the areas become neither one thing nor the other, or where you have a dominant culture like Islam, which is very fundamentalist and powerful within their own group, it's simply colonization. And Faye makes that point really well, that these no-go zones are essentially colonies, they're outposts, and that it demonstrates that integration and assimilation on a large scale can never ever work.
Yeah. Can I just give you a quote? I think
please.
You were thinking about this. Faye says, all assimilation is equivalent to cultural genocide for the assimilator and the assimilated. 100% agree to this. It's cultural genocide.
Yeah.
Both are hurt.
I totally agree. Yeah, and it is a kind of ethnocide, isn't it? It's ridiculous, really. No other civilization in the world in history has gone down this path of masochism towards its own group and culture. So yeah, I think I'll give you the last word on this in a minute, but I think from me, I would say definitely go out and buy the book if you haven't already. It's been touted as the unofficial Bible of the identitarian movement, and for good reason. So I definitely strong recommendation from me. And Alex, you too? Yeah,
I totally agree. This book is a must read. Any person that is interested in the European resistance has to read this book. If you're interested about identity and cultural clashes and all those things, it's a must. And also, I want to give a shout out to the publisher, Arctos, which has been very busy in the last years, publishing a lot of important books from many various authors. Most of them, of course, aided by the cosmopolitan left, such as Duggan, Evola, and so on, de Benoit, Faye. And I totally want you to support these people because they're doing God's work, publishing very important books that are very important in our culture warfare. So thanks, Arctos.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I'd go and check some of their titles out because, like Alex said, they've published some great translations and some great works. So it's definitely worth checking out. Okay, so now we're going to move on and talk a little bit about the Italian elections, which are happening right now today, and we've got Alex and Laura on to discuss the relevant points on that. So Laura, if I can hand over to you and you can speak briefly to Alex about what the chances of the parties are and things like that.
Yeah, so we covered this topic in quite some depth in the pilot episode of the podcast. But for people that weren't listening, Alex, could you perhaps just give us a bit of a refresh on who you're recommending to support and what their chances are?
Yes, of course. The polls themselves haven't changed much when it comes to any numbers. The center-right coalition is still around 37%, and the Five-Star Movement is around 25, 27, and the left has basically the rest. It hasn't changed much, but in the last days before today, day of the election, there's been a lot of campaigning against mostly Lega and Salvini, their candidate. And as in the article I published, I think 3 days ago, one of the NGOs guilty of basically interfering and trying to influence the Italian elections, called AVETS, which is also active in the US. You might have seen their stance on the gun control thing. They have basically been printing and publishing banners and ads against Lega, trying to slander them and basically reminding southern Italians that Lega and mostly Salvini hates them and that he thinks that they smell. You know, like this kind of low-level kind of propaganda.
Yeah.
And guess who's funding this NGO? Our dear George Soros.
Shock.
That man truly loves giving money to people like AVETS. So yeah, and why am I talking about this? It's not just because I want to remind people how disgusting and filthy Soros is, but because I think that Lega is doing much better in the polls than what they are showing us. I think Lega is easily around 20% and not just the 14, 15 they give them now. And it's very likely that Lega will be the first party in the center-right coalition, which I hope will succeed and win the elections. And all this kind of hysteria caused by the left, I think it's a sign. I think that people are leaning more and more towards Lega and therefore towards a Neurosceptic party, which is of course scaring the progressive left. And at the same time, like yesterday or actually 2 days ago, a funny thing happened that showed how biased and impartial the media in Italy are. Basically, some probably fascist or anyway far-right activists marked the houses of some Antifa with like some stickers saying "Here lives an Antifa." And of course, the first thing our media did was, "Oh no, the fascist from Casa Pound and Forza Nova must have done this. This is like when they put the David stars on houses of Jews, blah blah blah." They started panicking about it. But these are the same journalists and the same outlets who basically barely talked about an aggression towards a couple of Casa Pound activists. Basically, this man with his wife was out during the night, putting some flyers and posters on walls for the propaganda for the party. Yeah. And they were attacked while the wife was in the car, and she was also pregnant. While the man, he was just putting stuff on walls. They started beating him, and he basically begged the Antifa, because of course it had to be Antifa doing this, to leave his wife out of it because she was pregnant. And the answer of the communists was, "Who cares? The kid is going to be a fascist anyway." And they basically tried to break into the car. This isn't a joke. This actually happened. These people attacked 2 unarmed citizens, one of them being pregnant, and our media basically didn't cover it. Only like two of the main right-wing newspapers talked about it, not even too much. But like all the leftist media basically said, oh yes, two Gazapon activists were attacked, that's it. And the following day, it was over. But this thing of the Antifa stickers being put outside of alleged activist is being treated like it's the biggest thing happening in months. Shows how the bias and how scared left is.
Yeah, I mean, you can always read the media just before an election because they tend to focus on certain stories which they know are going to influence public decision. And I think they always try to kind of play down the results that they don't want people to vote for. So we had that in the UK with Brexit, they said we had no chance. And obviously in the USA with Trump, they said he had no chance as well. But one of the stories that we spoke about 2 weeks ago was the Italian guy that shot, was it 5?
6, I think.
Six people. Have any stories such as that, for example, had much of an effect, do you think, on the elections, or are people kind of not going with it?
I think the main result of what happened in Macerata, first the murder and dismemberment of Pamela, and then the accident with Traini shooting up 6 people, of who none of them died, of course, they all wounded. The only thing that these things achieved is more polarization. But when it comes to votes, it didn't change much. Because like most people are already leaning towards the right, focus on saying that this is the government fault because they are letting the migrants in, which causes, of course, cultural clashes, which is also the thing that Salvini said, and of course, it's also the truth. And the left, and also Avets, started blaming it on Salvini, saying that basically Salvini is the moral culprit behind it because he's a hate preacher. Avets even launched a petition against Salvini saying that basically he is the shooter, basically. It's crazy. It's crazy. But yeah. Let's go back to Salvini and why he is our guy and why Lega is our party. Why do we want Lega to succeed? Right now, Lega is the only party with a fairly good audience and voters that actually can do something if they win the elections. And just yesterday, Salvini published a very beautiful video, basically showing the pictures of him growing up from being a kid to being the man he is now, and talking about what he wants to do for Italy today, but also for Italy in the future. And one of the key points Salvini is this. He says that the left wants more migrants to basically populate and work for us, you know, all the usual things they say. But Salvini says what we need to do is to make babies and build a future for them. And I think it's a very important thing because like nobody ever talks about the natality problem. Nobody. Lega and, well, of course, Casa Pound, but Casa Pound is right now irrelevant when it comes to parties, but it might not be relevant after the elections, we don't know yet. He has touched the natality point and how making babies is good. And I was also present at his rally last Saturday in Milan, and he also made that point again in front of 50,000 people. He's basically telling Italians that it's important that we repopulate our country, which sounds like common sense because it is, but compared to what other politicians always say, it's fresh, it's new, and it's great. He's introducing these talking points that until now, in Italy at least, they've been only used by the so-called far-right parties. Like if you talked about natality in Italy like 15 years ago, they would outright call you a fascist and say, oh yeah, you want to do like Mussolini, who gave money to big families because he wanted to make soldiers and blah, blah, blah. But now Lega, which is probably the main right-wing party, is actually doing that, and it's great.
Yeah, it's completely refreshing, and it's something that's so basic that it shouldn't be so shocking when somebody says it. But I mean, the media constantly promote, don't they, for us to, you know, have a child-free life, and, you know, having babies is bad for the environment, and all sorts of daft stories. I think Viktor Orban's doing some really good stuff in Hungary as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an interesting point that you raised, because the media are promoting that we need immigration to help our declining birth rates, and they never promote just the idea of having our own children. So it is good to hear.
Yeah, and to add another thing that Salvini basically recently said, You all know about the Elsa scandal, you know, the rumors saying that they want to make Elsa, one of the new Disney princesses,
Oh yeah, yeah.
lesbian. And
Yeah.
Salvini made a comment about that, and he basically said, we need to stop these things. And that's also another shocking, but shouldn't be, thing that the opposition is saying. He's basically calling out Disney, saying these things don't belong in kids' content. We shouldn't politicize and, of course, add various, you know, things like lesbians and gays and things for kids. Just let them be innocent, because they're kids and they're supposed to be innocent. Nothing about sexuality should be, even like heterosexual stuff, like, I don't know, every stuff should be in kids' show, because those are kids' show. And why do you want to introduce one of the most beloved, the late recent princesses, to be a lesbian? What's gonna be next? The next princess is gonna be a race mixer? I just don't understand. Like, if we don't put a stop to this thing, put an end to these things, it's not gonna end.
Yeah. Well, they're targeting children, aren't they, so that it becomes normal.
Exactly.
I mean, there's lots of reports going on about, you know, things that are taught in sex education in schools, and I mean, even transgender issues being taught in schools. And have you seen the pictures of the men going into libraries in America?
Oh yeah, the infamous picture. Of course, I saw it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was in America, though, right?
Yeah. I don't think we've had anything like that in Europe yet.
Yet.
Maybe Canada as well with Trudeau. I think he's doing some.
Yeah, all these things, sadly,
stuff
and I'm pretty sure that our American listeners will agree, mostly come from cultural Marxism, which is basically nowadays based in America. Like all those weird professors and college professors that, like I was watching one videos of Tucker, you know, from Fox News, discussing this college professor. Basically, she wants to remove the word man from everything, even like the word woman. Like Tucker asked her, but you're a woman, and in the word woman there is man. What are you gonna do? And she said, oh, we can just remove man, and you can just call me a person. That will be less offensive. These people are insane, and sadly, American culture is that strong and powerful that the worst things often reach Europe. And one of those things, of course, is all those big corporations like Disney who own most cartoons and all those things, and they can easily influence our kids. And this is why I ask, and I'm sure people will do it anyway, don't bring your kids to Disney shows. They don't deserve your money. They don't. Because they don't want the best for your kids. They just want your money and to, well, fuck up the mind of your kids.
Yeah. So I think we are almost running out of time. So just to go back to the Italian elections very quickly before we end, what time can we expect some results to come in?
Hopefully tomorrow in the morning. But if you're very passionate about politics and elections, you can follow the elections live. We're probably going to tweet something on our account on Twitter, and I'm sure there is going to be many outlets covering them.
Yeah, we can stay up tonight and keep our followers on Twitter updated by posting the results if you like.
I sure will.
Yeah. Okay, so William, is it okay to pass back over to you just to kind of finalise the show?
Right, well, thank you, Laura. That's great. I hope our listeners are a bit more up to speed on the Italian election, and as we discussed, we did mention this quite heavily on the pilot episode, and that's still on our Twitter page if you want to go back and familiarise yourself with what's going on. Aside from that, well, we're going to keep our fingers crossed for Lega in the elections, and we hope that they have a strong showing and are a part of the next government. That would be fantastic. And to recap as well, definitely go and check out Janice for Brexit on Twitter. Janice Atkinson, member of the European Parliament, who's raising the issues that are affecting white South Africans at the moment. So with that said, I think we're out of time. We're all done. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.